I think that the line that makes this whole story hang together is the one that comes at the very end, where Jacob says, "I did not know God was here in this place. I did not know that God would visit me here." God had come to Jacob not in a temple, not at a religious service, but outside in an inhospitable wilderness, inhospitable to the point where Jacob was using a rock as a pillow. And God came to him not because he had cause to say, "Well done, good and faithful servant," not because Jacob had showed exemplary faith or character. Jacob was on the run with nothing, and we skip over this plot point in the reading. But as I said to the kids, Jacob was fleeing for his life at this point. After stealing the blessing, his deception split his family, and his brother was angry enough to want to kill him. So Jacob is a fugitive with nothing, running, destitute, to the point where, again, he was using a rock as a pillow. And this is when God comes to him. So let's go back and look at the story. If you were here last week, you might remember that I said when God is working out God's plan for redemption, God needs to use the people who need to be redeemed along the way in order to do that. Well, this new generation of Abraham and Sarah's family, Isaac and Rebekah and their two sons, they certainly carry on that grand tradition. In fact, what we see in this story is actually very similar to what we talked about in Abraham and Sarah's story, in that Abraham and Sarah had this promise from God, but they struggled to let God fulfill that promise. And instead, they did a bunch of questionable things over the years in order to try and ensue that they would have that promise that God made, that threefold promise that God gave. A people, so a people as numerous as the night sky, a land to call home, and a blessing. I will be your God and you will be my people. You will be the people of God. And if you're wondering why Rebekah, Isaac's wife, is helping one of her sons steal the blessing from the other one of her sons, it's for the same reason that Abraham and Sarah were doing all the things, that Hagar got involved and all of the things happened that maybe shouldn't have happened in their story. Because when Rebekah was pregnant with Jacob and Esau, she received a prophecy. So she felt, the text says she felt the twins struggling against each other in the womb. These were her first children. She didn't realize. That's probably fairly normal. But she was very concerned. And she was concerned enough to be praying about this quite a bit. And in response, God granted her a prophecy about the future of her family. And God said to her, it's because they struggle because they are the leaders of two different nations. And they will struggle with one another through their lives, and the elder will serve the younger. Now, the inheritance system at that time, basically everywhere, was that the oldest son would inherit. They would inherit the leadership of the clan. If that was their lot, they would inherit the property. They would inherit, one would assume, the right and responsibility to carry on God's blessing, to be the father of God's great nation. Because if Rebekah's prophecy is true, only one of the sons will continue God's blessing to be God's nation, because they're to be different nations than the other one, it can be reasoned, will not. And it's not recorded anywhere whether she shared this prophecy with Isaac or what Isaac thought about this prophecy. Well, if she did share it, then we know what Isaac thought about this prophecy, because as the children grew, Isaac's favorite was Esau. He was the oldest. He was the hunter. He was a big manly man. That's where the whole, that's why we have all this commentary about hunting and putting the goat on the hand, the goat skin on. All of that is a characterization for Esau. Esau was a jock, basically. he was out there. He's bringing in, he's bringing back the meat. He's doing all these things. And when they talk about Jacob, they called Jacob a tent dweller. which I don't know the scholarship on that particular term, but I'm wondering if Mama's boy is kind of a good translation. It was not meant to be. It was another characterization. I mean, they didn't exactly say that Jacob spent all his time in his parents' basement playing video games, but it's close. Jacob, though, is also a trickster. That's sort of the how you would characterize his character in this story. This story is part of the oldest source in the whole Bible. So this is one of the earliest recorded stories in the Bible. And they have these stories, they all have the characteristics you find in these old folk tales. God interacts more with people, like you see this in other religions as well. You have certain types of characters that you find. You have the heroes, and the trickster is one of those. And Jacob was described as the clever one. And whether it's for this reason or for the reasons of the prophecy, Jacob was his mother's favorite. So Rebecca has decided that she's going to do everything she can to see God's prophecy fulfilled. This prophecy in which the eldest would serve the youngest. And Rebecca has decided that the way to make sure this comes about is to help her youngest secure this blessing from Abraham, who is not listening to her. So, Abraham has his own plans for where the blessing, where the inheritance is going to go. So Rebecca helped Jacob lie and cheat in order to steal that which Abraham was planning to give to the eldest. One thing that's interesting about this, another thing that's interesting, is in sort of a foreshadowing of how God always turns expectations upside down. Throughout the ancestry cycle, through the beginning, the youngest in the family nearly always inherits. It's always upside down. Nearly always they receive the blessing. This happens all the way up to David. Do you remember David out in the fields? Where's your other son? Oh, him, the youngest. So it was not that God needed Jacob and Rebecca. I'm just going to go on a limb and say it's not that God needed Jacob and Rebecca to lie and steal in order to fulfill God's plan and God's inherited blessing. But they did. And because of that, when we meet Jacob, he is experiencing the consequences of this family dysfunction that has gone on. He is fleeing for his life from an enraged older brother without even something more than without even something more comfortable than a rock to sleep on. And that is where his amazement stems from, when he realizes that God will still be with him and will still bless him, despite where he's found himself, despite finding himself alone in the wilderness. He was surprised that God was out in the wilderness. He, like many of us, maybe has forgotten that God speaks through the created world, that God is in the literal wilderness. God is not trapped in sanctuaries and churches, but speaks to us through nature, through the very rocks that we have to lie our head on sometimes. in the grass and in the trees. That creation, the fact that in this story creation mediates God's presence shows that sometimes that gets through to us in ways that nothing else can. Jacob said he didn't know that God was in that place. So this story, for one, is teaching us that God's presence lives in and that God speaks to us through the creation. And it's another story about the importance of the natural world around us. But it's also a story about our importance. Us, the bearers of God's image. Even when we fail to live up to that. Jacob didn't know that God would come to him in the wilderness, but Jacob also didn't know that God would come to him anyway. He was at his lowest point, and God comes to him and speaks to him of the promise. Because God's work of redemption remains secure, even when our circumstances are not. God works through faithful people, but God's purposes will not be derailed when we are not faithful and when those around us fail us. In this story, Jacob continues to suffer exile as a result of his actions, and it, like I said earlier, it takes a long time for his brother to forgive him and for the family to be reunited. He did eventually, but until then, Jacob lived with the consequences of everything that happened up until that point. And as he did, God was with him. God continued to bless him and his family. The blessing still went with him, and so did the promise. So in times of wilderness, in times of exile, don't doubt that God is still with us. Whether it's a wilderness of our own making or one that we have been cast into, God is there, waiting to speak to us of God's promises, waiting to guide us home. Amen.